I'm a single dad, and back then, my son Lucas was just 6 years old. That Christmas felt special because, for the first time in years, we were finally starting to feel a little more stable. Life wasn't easy by any means, but I had landed a new job, and we were living in a modest but cozy apartment. It was the first time I could really give him a proper Christmas experience. So, when I saw the ad for the community Christmas fair downtown, I knew I had to take him. It was a simple event with food stalls, games for kids, and something called Santa's Workshop, which seemed to be the main attraction. Lucas was excited the moment we got there, and just seeing him like that made everything worth it. The fair was packed, with that classic Christmas vibe, twinkling lights in every color you could imagine, the smell of caramel popcorn and cinnamon in the air, and people chatting and laughing everywhere you looked. While Lucas ran around playing games, I kept my eye on him, trying not to lose sight of the little reindeer hat he was wearing. But as I watched him, I started noticing something odd. One of the volunteers at Santa's Workshop, a tall guy with a scruffy beard and nervous eyes, seemed more interested in the people than the event itself. He was dressed as an elf, wearing the green and red costume, but instead of helping with the activities or interacting with the kids, he kept scanning the crowd. At one point, I saw him fidgeting with something in the pocket of his apron, and it made me a little uneasy. Still, with so much going on, I brushed it off, assuming he was just tired or bored of volunteering. After exploring the stalls and games for a while, it was finally Lucas's turn to visit Santa's workshop. He was beyond excited to meet the real Santa and hand over his wish list. As we stood in line, I noticed the elf again. He was now stationed near the entrance of the cabin where the kids went to meet Santa. It was almost like he was studying everyone who walked in, especially the adults. He'd occasionally pretend to adjust decorations on the stall, but his eyes were glued to people. I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I was overthinking it, stressed out from juggling everything on my own. But something about him just didn't sit right with me. When it was our turn, Lucas and I walked into the cabin, where another volunteer, a middle-aged man dressed as Santa, greeted my son with a warm smile. Lucas handed over his list, and the whole moment was so sweet that, for a little while, I forgot my concerns. But as we walked out, we passed the strange elf again. This time, he was standing near the exit, scribbling something in a small notepad. That really unsettled me, and my gut told me something was off. Still, it was getting late, and Lucas was tired, so I pushed the thought aside and headed home. But as we walked to the car, I couldn't stop thinking about him. On the drive home, Lucas couldn't stop talking about Santa and how he promised to read his list. I smiled and listened, but my mind was somewhere else. That uneasy feeling just wouldn't go away. The image of that elf writing something down stuck with me. When we got back to our apartment, I made Lucas some hot chocolate, our usual tradition on chilly nights. But while he watched a Christmas special on TV, my mind started racing. Why would someone who was supposed to entertain kids be so focused on the adults? And what could he possibly have been writing down in the middle of a community fair? I decided to keep Lucas entertained and grabbed my phone to quickly look up the fair. I found some posts on social media with pictures from the event. In a few of them, there was the elf again, always in the background, watching. That's when my uneasiness turned into a real sense of alarm. Something about this guy didn't sit right with me. Then, as I scrolled through the photos, I noticed something that sent chills down my spine. The elf wasn't just hanging around Santa's workshop. He showed up at different booths throughout the fair, always lurking in the background but never directly involved in anything. In one of the photos, he was standing near the donation booth, staring intently at an open bag on the counter. My stomach churned, and for the first time, I felt guilty for not doing something right then and there. I spent the rest of the night trying to shake off what I'd seen, but the uneasiness was like a weight on my chest. Lucas fell asleep early, worn out from all the running and playing, but I couldn't shut my eyes. Eventually, I decided to do something about it. I called the fair's organizing committee. Their number was on the flyer I got at the entrance, and explained what I had noticed. I got straight to the point, but tried to sound rational. I described the volunteer's strange behavior, his suspicious notes, and how he seemed more focused on watching people than actually participating in the activities. The person on the other end, a tired-sounding woman, thanked me for calling, but didn't seem overly concerned. She said something like, "He's probably just shy, but I'll look into it." I felt like I'd done my part, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I went to bed still uneasy. The next morning I was woken up by the sound of the doorbell. It was one of my neighbors, Mr. Antonio, a kind older man who lived on the same floor. He looked visibly shaken and told me someone had tried to break into his apartment during the night. He said he'd heard footsteps in the hallway, and when he checked through the peephole, saw a man in a hoodie trying to force his lock. Luckily, he turned on his lights and made some noise, which scared the guy off. My blood ran cold. I can't explain why, but the first thing that popped into my head was the face of that elf from the fair. It couldn't be a coincidence. The nagging feeling I'd had the night before had turned into full-blown fear. After Mr. Antonio went back to his apartment, I decided to call the police. I told them about what my neighbor had just reported, and mentioned the strange behavior of the elf at the fair. The officer on the phone listened carefully and, to my surprise, asked if I could describe the man. I told her what I remembered. He was tall, thin, had a scruffy beard, and his eyes were small and constantly darting around, like he was always looking for something. She thanked me and said they'd send a patrol to the area. The entire day, I was on edge, constantly looking out the window and wondering if there was really a connection between what happened in the building and that man from the fair. Meanwhile, Lucas played on the rug with his toy cars, completely oblivious to the storm of thoughts racing through my mind. Late in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was the police. They informed me that they had received other calls about similar incidents in the area, and, curiously, all the reports pointed to locations near the community fair. The scariest part? Someone had already described a man resembling the elf I had mentioned. Suddenly, everything clicked. That guy had been using the event to observe residents, likely picking targets for break-ins. I felt relieved for trusting my instincts, but at the same time, a chill ran down my spine. We had been dealing with someone dangerous, and I had been just a few feet away from him while my son played innocently. Later that night, I got another call from the police. They had identified the suspect and discovered that he wasn't an official volunteer at the event. The police even found the notebook he had been carrying, filled with detailed descriptions of people he had selected. Addresses, notes about bags and belongings, and even schedules people had casually mentioned, like when they'd be out of their homes. They confirmed what I had feared. If he hadn't been reported, there likely would have been more victims that night. Although the suspect was arrested, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease. The sense of safety I once felt was gone. Christmas, a time that had always been about joy and light, now carried a different tone that year. I spent the next few days reinforcing the locks on our apartment and being extra cautious with Lucas. What scared me most wasn't just being face to face with someone so manipulative, but the realization that he had exploited the Christmas spirit and the trust of innocent people to commit his crimes. Still, there was some comfort in knowing that my decision to act had prevented other families from going through something worse. It may not have been the magical Christmas I had hoped for, but at least, on that night, I was able to protect my son and my community. On Christmas morning, as I watched Lucas open his presents with the same excitement he'd shown at the fair, a wave of mixed emotions hit me. Part of me was still shaken by everything that had happened, but another part felt immense relief, knowing that following my gut had saved the day. I couldn't stop thinking about how different things might have been if I'd ignored the signs. In that moment, I realized that, as a father, my most important job wasn't just giving my son happy moments, but ensuring that he was safe, even when danger came from the least expected places. In the days that followed, the story of the imposter elf spread through the neighborhood. The community fair got more attention than ever, and the organizers promised to strengthen security for future events. As disturbing as the experience was, it brought our community closer together. People started sharing stories about things they had noticed but brushed off, proving that sometimes, trusting your instincts can be the difference between danger and safety. As for me, that night taught me never to ignore that nagging feeling when something seems off. We still celebrate Christmas every year and still attend events, but now I do so with a more watchful eye. After all, it was that vigilance that kept my family and neighbors safe on that cold December night.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel. I remember that day like it was yesterday. I've never really been a fan of office holiday parties, but the Christmas party in 2019, that was different. I worked in a pretty standard office, gray cubicles, coffee machines that were always breaking down, the whole deal. Like every year, HR organized a Secret Santa. I always thought those gift exchanges felt kind of forced, but, you can't exactly skip them without coming off as antisocial. Back then, I was just another analyst trying to hang on until the holiday break. The vibe was the same as always. Christmas music playing softly in the background, cheap string lights taped to the windows, and everyone pretending they were happy to be there. But something about this particular party felt off, and I didn't fully realize it until the gift exchange started. The first few gifts were normal: funny mugs, chocolate sets, the usual stuff no one actually wants but pretends to like. The room was filled with lighthearted chatter and laughter, at least until Brenda opened her gift. I'll never forget her face. She went pale as soon as she pulled off the wrapping paper. It was a picture frame, but the photo inside stopped her cold. It was a shot of her standing in front of her parents' house, a picture she swore she had never shared with anyone at work. Brenda tried to play it off, but you could tell she was shaken. The room got weirdly quiet for a moment, and then someone cracked a joke to break the tension. The party carried on, at least on the surface. After that, I started paying closer attention to the gifts, and honestly, it was impossible not to notice how strange things were getting. Next up was Richard, the loudest guy in the office, always cracking jokes. He unwrapped a black notebook, which seemed harmless enough at first, but when he opened it, that's when things got weird. The first few pages were filled with handwritten notes, detailed comments about things he had said during meetings or casual conversations in the break room. One of the lines read, "You always eat lunch alone on Mondays, don't you?" He let out this nervous laugh, but you could see his whole demeanor shift. It was no longer just a silly little game, and in that moment I realized Brenda wasn't the only one who felt uneasy. The turning point, though, was when it was my turn to open my gift. I wasn't expecting anything special, but whatever I had in mind, it definitely wasn't this. My present was a small box wrapped in crumpled red paper, like someone had rushed through it. Inside was a necklace I didn't recognize, but the note that came with it chilled me to my core. It said, "You left this at the park last Saturday. It looks better on you." The thing is, I had been at the park that Saturday, alone, and what made it worse? The necklace wasn't mine, but it looked like it had been chosen specifically to match an outfit I'd been wearing that day. The feeling that someone had been watching me was so strong, it was like the walls of the room were closing in. After that, it became painfully clear that something was seriously wrong. As the gift exchange went on, people started opening their presents more cautiously, almost bracing themselves for whatever creepy surprise might be inside. And sure enough, the weirdness kept escalating. Carol, who was new to the team, unwrapped a set of car keys for the exact model she'd just bought. The catch: she had never mentioned the car at work. She didn't even park it in the company lot. With every gift, the tension in the room thickened. It felt like whoever this Secret Santa was, they knew things no one should know. It was beyond unsettling. When the party ended, no one was pretending things were fine anymore. Small groups started forming, and we all began talking about the gifts. That's when I realized every item had one thing in common: personal details, the kind of stuff only someone watching us really closely would know. Then, the question that none of us wanted to ask, but that was clearly on everyone's mind, came up. Could it be someone here? It wasn't like just anyone could have access to such specific information. Deep down, we all knew that made it even scarier, because it meant the person responsible was among us, in the same room, watching our reactions. By the following Monday, it was the only thing anyone could talk about. Those of us who had received the most unsettling gifts, me, Brenda, Richard, and Carol, decided to meet after work to figure out what was going on. We picked a small cafe near the office, a quiet spot we went to occasionally. Everyone brought their gifts, like we were collecting evidence for some kind of investigation. When we laid everything out on the table, it felt like we were in an episode of a crime drama. We went over the items and messages, trying to find any clue that might reveal who was behind it all, but it seemed like they had thought of everything. None of the notes were signed, and while the objects themselves were generic, they were deeply personal at the same time. That was the most unsettling part. It was during this meeting that Brenda shared something that gave us all chills. She said that, the week before, she'd noticed a car parked outside her house for 2 nights in a row, its headlights off. At the time, she brushed it off as a coincidence, but now she wasn't so sure. Richard, on the other hand, mentioned that he'd recently felt like someone was following him when he left the gym, and Carol said her dog had been barking nonstop at the window a few nights before the party, like it sensed something or someone outside. Hearing these stories connected the dots in a way none of us could ignore. This wasn't just about some weird presence anymore. It felt like someone was obsessed. And the worst part? It was someone who worked with us every single day. At that point, we knew we had to do something. This wasn't just uncomfortable, it had turned into a full-blown stalking situation. Our first idea was to check the office security cameras. After all, someone had to bring the gifts to the party, and that might give us a lead. We went to the head of security, Gilbert, an older guy who always hung out at the front desk with his old radio and a friendly smile. We explained the situation, and while he was hesitant at first, he eventually agreed to help. We spent hours combing through footage from the days leading up to the party, but the best we could find was a shadowy figure dropping off packages in the event room. Whoever it was had planned everything carefully to avoid being caught. With no solid leads, we decided to pay closer attention to our co-workers. We were looking for anything unusual, any odd reactions. That's when we noticed something curious about Henry, one of the developers. He was always a quiet, reserved guy, almost invisible, but the week after the party, he seemed even more withdrawn. It was like he was actively avoiding eye contact or any kind of conversation. I remember one time seeing him quickly walk away when Richard mentioned the gifts during lunch. It raised our suspicions, but none of us wanted to outright accuse him without proof. Still, the idea that Henry could be behind it all started creeping into our thoughts, and we couldn't shake it. It was on a Thursday, almost a week after the party, when everything started to come together. Richard, always bolder than the rest of us, decided to confront Henry. During the break, he pulled him aside for a conversation in the hallway. From a distance, we could see the tension rising. Henry looked nervous, his eyes darting around, and his answers were short and clipped, like he just wanted the conversation to end as quickly as possible. When Richard came back to our table, he told us Henry had denied everything, but something about his tone felt off. That was enough for us to decide we needed to dig deeper. That night I stayed late at the office with Carol. We were searching for any clue, anything in the files or internal systems that might help us figure this out. That's when we stumbled upon something in the email history. Henry had been sending himself personal emails through the company system, but the attachments were unsettling. Photos of the parking lot, spreadsheets with employees' check-in and check-out times, and even screenshots from private social media accounts. It was invasive and downright creepy. We couldn't believe what we were looking at. This wasn't just obsession, it was dangerous behavior. We saved the evidence and decided to go straight to HR the next morning. On Friday, we handed everything over to HR. We showed them the emails, the attachments, and explained the entire context. It was impossible to downplay how serious this was. Marta, the HR manager, was visibly shaken as she reviewed the material. "This is way too serious. We need to involve upper management, and maybe even the police," she said firmly, though her voice was tense. Later that day, Henry was called into a private meeting. We weren't in the room, but the dead silence inside spoke volumes. When the door finally opened, we saw Henry walking out, escorted by security, carrying a box with a few belongings from his desk. He avoided looking at any of us, and even though we had a million questions, no one dared to say a word. What followed was a mix of relief and unease. The company announced that legal measures were being taken and that Henry was barred from coming near any employees. We also found out he had a history of strange behavior in previous jobs, something that apparently hadn't come up during his hiring process. The police got involved, and from what we heard, he was being investigated for similar actions outside of work. Despite all of this, the feeling of being watched didn't go away easily. For weeks, I kept looking over my shoulder, checking my windows and avoiding predictable routines. afraid he might come back. Over time, things started to return to normal, but no one at the office was quite the same after what happened. Holiday parties never included a Secret Santa again, and honestly, no one missed it. The whole incident became a sort of unspoken taboo. No one directly mentioned Henry, but the silence itself said plenty. Even though the company assured us they'd taken every legal and security precaution, the fear that something like this could happen again lingered with all of us. To this day, whenever I think about that gift exchange, I get chills. Not just because of the invasion of privacy, but because it reminded us of something even more unsettling. You never really know the people around you. Henry was just another coworker, a familiar face in a sea of other familiar faces, until he wasn't. And the scariest part? For the longest time, he was right there with us, watching everything. It's the kind of thing that makes you second-guess even the most innocent, "Good morning." Since then, whenever Christmas rolls around, my mind drifts back to that party, and all I can think is, never again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.
Every Christmas, my community puts together an event that's almost sacred to us, the Christmas tree lighting ceremony. I live in a small neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone. This event is like the big deal to close out the year. It was 2019, I was 32, and working from home as a freelance designer. The ceremony was always a great excuse to get out and socialize since I spent most of my time glued to my computer. At that time, I was pretty stressed with work deadlines, but my 8-year-old niece begged me to go, so I gave in. The tree was set up in the Central Park, and it was massive, almost 30 feet tall. Everyone always looked forward to the moment the lights would turn on. But that year, there was something new. A different company was handling the lights. They'd never outsourced it before, but apparently, the budget was tight, so they hired this guy, Mr. Edward, who owned a small event company. He seemed pretty normal, maybe a little reserved. Gray hair, round glasses, and he always wore a vest with a bunch of pockets. The ceremony was scheduled for December 20th, but during that week, I noticed something odd. Every night when I'd go for a walk to clear my head, I'd see Mr. Edward fiddling with the cables in the tree's control panel way after work hours. It was weird because the park had night security, so there was no real reason for him to be there alone at that hour. At first, I thought maybe he was just a perfectionist, making sure everything was flawless for the big night. But something about the way he acted didn't sit right with me. He always seemed like he was trying to hide what he was doing. On the night of the 18th, I saw him again, looking around like he wanted to make sure no one was watching before opening the control panel. That really got my attention. Why would someone need that much privacy just to fix Christmas lights? I decided to stay back and watch, pretending to check my phone. I saw him open one of the control boxes, take something small out of his pocket, and put it inside. My curiosity was through the roof, but I wasn't sure if I was overthinking it. The next day, I couldn't shake it off, so I went back to the park early, when no one was around, and checked the box myself. I'll admit, my hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside, I found this weird little device hooked up to the main wires. It didn't look like regular lighting equipment. It was a small black piece with a tiny lens in the center, like a camera. My heart was pounding. Why would there be a hidden camera there? I took out my phone and snapped a few pictures before putting everything back the way it was. I thought about going straight to park security, but what if I was wrong? I decided to keep it to myself until I could figure out what was really going on. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that little lens staring back at me. Was I stumbling onto something serious, or was I just being paranoid? The next day, I went back to the park, this time even more cautious. I stayed at a distance, watching Mr. Edward. Sure enough, he was there again, messing with another box. When he finally left, I checked it out, and, just like before, there was another device inside. This one was slightly different, though it had tiny antennas. At that point, I knew this wasn't normal. Whatever this was, it definitely wasn't part of a Christmas light setup. Back home, I started researching the type of equipment I had seen. That's when it hit me, they were surveillance devices, possibly being used as data theft access points. My stomach turned. Why would someone use a Christmas event for something like this? I couldn't stop thinking about all the families coming to the ceremony, kids running around the park, people taking pictures near the tree. Everyone could have been spied on without even knowing. I had to act, but I also knew confronting Mr. Edward directly could be risky. I decided to take the photos and everything I discovered to the park administration. The manager, Ms. Marta, was usually all smiles, but when she saw the pictures, her face turned serious immediately. "This is serious, dear. None of this is in the contract with his company," she said, already picking up the phone to call the police. While she was on the call, I stood by the office window, nerves on edge. What if he figured out I'd tampered with the boxes? When the police arrived, I explained everything I'd seen and showed them the photos and the devices. They said they would investigate but asked me not to mention anything to the neighbors yet so as not to tip off Mr. Edward. That night, the tension in my house was unbearable. I kept looking out the window, wondering if he had already realized something was wrong. The next day, I noticed plainclothes officers patrolling the park. I tried to act normal, but I was on edge, anxious to know if they would find anything. Around 5 p.m., I got a call from Ms. Marta. "The police found more devices scattered throughout the park," she said. "It looks like this guy was monitoring the entire area. They're planning to arrest him tonight when he shows up." My heart was racing. I couldn't believe something like this was happening at our peaceful little Christmas ceremony. When night fell, I couldn't stay home, I had to see what was going to happen. I went to the park and stayed at a safe distance, trying to blend in while watching the officers take their positions. Mr. Edward showed up around 10 p.m., moving the same way he always did, slightly hunched, constantly looking around as if he was always suspicious of something. He started fiddling with one of the boxes, and that's when the police made their move. The shock on his face was unmistakable, though he tried to play it off, claiming he was just doing some last-minute technical adjustments for the event. It didn't fly. They searched his car and found more suspicious equipment, including a laptop filled with data he'd collected from the neighborhood. By then, people from the neighborhood started gathering at the park, drawn by the commotion. It was a shock to everyone. Nobody could believe that someone would use such a symbolic, heartwarming event, full of Christmas spirit, for something so underhanded. The police explained that he had been installing cameras and access points to monitor cell phones and steal information like passwords and bank details. It was an elaborate scheme, and he used his company as a cover to infiltrate small communities like ours. I felt conflicted, relieved that I'd stopped him, but also outraged at his audacity. In the days that followed, the story was all anyone could talk about in the neighborhood. The police continued their investigation and discovered that Mr. Edward had pulled the same stunt in other places. His method was always the same: community events, preferably during festive times when people were relaxed and distracted. Here, he was unlucky because, as someone who works with technology, those devices immediately caught my attention. What sent shivers down my spine was realizing that if I hadn't noticed, he could have kept this going for months, maybe even years, spying not just on the park but on the surrounding homes as well. After the scandal was exposed, the tree lighting ceremony was postponed, but no one seemed to mind much. When it finally happened on Christmas Eve, the vibe was different. That innocent, joyful feeling wasn't there anymore. It felt like everyone was more cautious, more aware. It was a relief to see the lights go on without anything weird happening. But for me, that Christmas will always stand out as the strangest one of my life. Even now, whenever I see overly elaborate Christmas decorations, I can't help but check the cables, the control boxes, and even the so-called security cameras. I never want to go through something like that again.
Please subscribe our YouTube channel.